There are stories buried in the shadows of history, not written in ink, but sealed in silence, locked away in crates and chambers where the air itself seemed forbidden to breathe. They whisper of convoys that vanished beneath black seas, of tunnels carved so deep the earth swallowed their secrets whole, of names struck from record as if the men had never lived at all. We are left with fragments, code words etched on yellowing pages, maps where whole regions have been blacked out, testimonies that trail off into sudden, chilling silence. Each fragment hints at something too dangerous to reveal, too unsettling to confess, something traded in secret corridors where truth was measured not by morality, but by usefulness. It is here, between the missing lines and erased photographs, that the real weight of forgotten wars lies waiting. Not in the battles we remember, but in the questions no one dared to answer. Chapter 1. Shadows beneath Operation Paperclip's smile. In the summer of 1945, as the fires of the Second World War smouldered into ash, trains rattled westward across a broken Germany under the discreet guard of American military police. Inside the cars were not just the familiar cargo of confiscated munitions or dismantled rocket engines, but a different kind of prize: men. German scientists, engineers and physicians whose names, for a time, vanished from public tribunals and war crime records, were quietly being escorted to secure camps. This movement was organized under the banner of Operation Paperclip, the program designed to transfer valuable enemy specialists into American custody. Officially, the program's stated purpose was technological competition against the Soviet Union. But in examining the record, one discovers a darker ledger, pages stained by omissions, redactions, and entire files marked compartmentalized with no explanation offered. Among the most revealing traces are the manifests from Nordhausen, where Mittelwerk had used slave labor from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp to construct V-2 rockets in tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains. Thousands of prisoners died in these caverns, crushed under collapses, starved, or beaten by SS overseers. After the war, Allied officers documented the conditions with photographs and affidavits. Yet in the surviving Nuremberg files, several names vanish from testimony between drafts of reports. It is not a clerical error. Comparison shows deliberate excision. One example is SS Sturmbahnführer Wilhelm Beigel, who supervised chemical storage at Mittelbau. Early drafts of British reports list him for prosecution, but subsequent American-controlled versions omit him entirely. Where did he go? The trail leads not to Spandau Prison, but to Fort Bliss, Texas, where the US Army tested long-range rockets. A declassified War Department memorandum dated November 2, 1946, refers to W. Beigel, necessary consultant, compartmented Project X201. The designation X201 appears in no other surviving files. Analysts suggest it refers to chemical or radiological research, possibly tied to experiments that were never revealed to the Allied Control Council. Survivors from Mittelbau had spoken of strange symptoms: burns that would not heal, bleeding gums, sudden hair loss. These accounts were filed under medical mistreatment and bundled with general camp cruelty, but cross-referenced against modern knowledge, they point toward radiation exposure. If the scientists in Nordhausen had experimented with uranium compounds or isotopes, such files would have been politically explosive. Yet when the Americans transferred key figures to the United States, their dossiers were rewritten, crimes reframed as alleged, and references to human experimentation quietly dropped. At Wright Field in Ohio, once the Air Materiel Command's test site, records show a series of interviews conducted between 1946 and 1948 with German aeronautical specialists. The transcripts, partially released under FOIA in the 1980s, contain references to Project Silver, a research program into high-altitude radiation shielding. One German physicist, whose identity remains redacted, testified about dose thresholds observed in Mittelwerk subjects. The phrase suggests human testing, yet the official archival commentary dismisses it as metaphorical. Researchers who examined the files argue that this dismissal was a bureaucratic maneuver to cover the implication that prisoners in Nordhausen had been subjected to controlled exposure experiments. None of this appeared in the sanitized biographies released when these scientists were presented to the American press as model immigrants in the 1950s. The clearest evidence of deliberate suppression appears in an Army Intelligence Corps report labeled CIC File 65563, dated August 1947. The report is stamped Restricted, Liaison Only, and lists a group of 6 German specialists relocated under Paperclip who, will not be available to congressional inquiry. The phrase is chilling in its bluntness. Congress had begun investigating whether Nazi scientists with criminal records had been imported into the United States. The War Department responded with assurances that all had been screened for war crimes. But CIC File 65.563 contradicts that claim, proving that certain individuals were deliberately shielded. Handwritten in the margin is the notation: DORA records sealed indefinitely. National security rationale. That sealing order would last decades. Meanwhile, the propaganda machine painted a different image. Newspapers in Huntsville, Alabama ran photographs of smiling German engineers at church picnics, their families dressed in American fashions, while reporters spoke of miracle rockets and scientific exchange. Werner von Braun became the face of America's space program. Yet in the shadows of his team lingered lesser-known men whose work had crossed lines even the Third Reich had once concealed. Survivors from Mittelbau who tried to raise the alarm in the early 1950s were ignored. Their testimonies drowned under Cold War urgency. Some were silenced by bureaucratic technicalities, claims filed too late, documents deemed insufficient, or witnesses dismissed as unreliable. A truth buried under paperwork is still a truth denied. By the 1960s, when NASA launched astronauts into orbit, several of these scientists held senior positions in American aerospace. Yet none of their wartime crimes appeared in official records. Declassified memos show why. A 1961 internal note from the Department of Defense explains that, in light of current geopolitical imperatives, disclosure of these details would undermine national confidence in ongoing space achievements. In plain terms, the race against the Soviets outweighed justice. The past was erased for the sake of the future. The paper trail was not destroyed but scattered, fragmented across agencies, mislabeled or buried under classification stamps that lasted half a century. It was not until the 1980s, after the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, that pieces began to surface. Researchers uncovered inconsistencies in personnel files, sudden gaps in camp records, and redacted interviews that hinted at suppressed atrocities. Some names could be reconstructed. Wilhelm Beigel, for example, resurfaced in correspondence with the Atomic Energy Commission under a pseudonym. Others remain shadows, initials in a file, or unnamed contributors to aerospace patents. The extent of their wartime crimes is still unknown. What is known is that justice was traded for knowledge, and the victims of Mittelbau Dora were written out of the equation. Even now, in archives from College Park to Kew, documents remain sealed. Scholars argue over whether the files contain evidence of nuclear research in the Reich, or simply further details of chemical experimentation. What is certain is that names, crimes, and technologies were buried under the machinery of Cold War secrecy. Operation Paperclip was not merely a transfer of scientists. It was the quiet rewriting of history, a deal struck in silence, and a compromise that left the truth scattered in fragments across sealed boxes. The smile of Paperclip's public image concealed a shadowed ledger of erased atrocities, buried not by oversight, but by deliberate design. Chapter 2. The Convoy that never reached Gdańsk. In the frozen winter of January 1945, as the Red Army surged through East Prussia and refugees crowded the icy roads toward the Baltic coast, a small fleet of vessels slipped quietly out of Pillau Harbour. Official German records list the operation as a medical evacuation under Kriegsmarine oversight. Its codename Eisbär, yet no such convoy ever made landfall in Gdańsk, Lübeck, or Kiel. Allied naval reports fail to confirm its arrival at any recognized port, and Soviet archives document no captured ships matching its manifests. Instead, the trail of convoy Eisbär fades into the Baltic, where rumors of a phantom cargo, technology rather than medicine, persisted in the whispers of sailors, dockworkers, and intelligence officers for decades. A surviving Kriegsmarine signal intercept, decrypted in 1947 but still heavily redacted, offers the first hint at the cargo's true nature. The communiqué, sent from Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters, orders all measures to protect Sonnenrad equipment during transit. The term Sonnenrad, literally sun wheel, does not appear in any Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine technical registries. However, British intelligence files from 1945 describe a high-frequency transmitter array under experimental development in Königsberg. The project aimed to extend secure radio signals beyond conventional line-of-sight limitations, possibly through ionospheric reflection. If true, the Sonnenrad system would have granted Berlin a communications reach capable of coordinating submarine operations across the Atlantic without fear of Allied interception. The loss or disappearance of such technology would explain the shroud of silence that followed. Testimonies gathered from Polish dockworkers in Gdynia add further intrigue. Several men recalled in post-war interviews the unloading of crates at night from vessels that matched the size of those in Convoy Eisbär. They described heavy boxes marked with the Reichsluftfahrtministerium seal and stenciled warnings in Gothic script. One worker, Antoni S., later gave sworn testimony to the Polish Commission for War Crimes that SS officers stood guard with strict orders that no one approach the cargo under penalty of death. Days later, he and others were reassigned, and when they returned, the vessels were gone. Whether the ships sailed again, were scuttled, or unloaded their freight into secret railcars bound inland remains unknown. The absence of paperwork, receipts, or port entries suggests deliberate erasure. By February 1945, Soviet forces had captured most of the Baltic coast, and reports from the Soviet Navy describe divers sent to Bornholm Island to investigate scuttled German craft. In one declassified Soviet salvage file, dated 1946, an officer notes that wrecks were stripped bare before arrival of divers, as though previously visited. The report accuses either local fishermen or Western intelligence operatives of interference, yet the level of precision required to remove bulky experimental transmitters under cover of war suggests more than casual looting. The theory emerged that British or American special operations units intercepted Convoy Eisbär before the Soviets arrived, seizing the technology to deny Moscow a strategic advantage. Supporting this view are gaps in British Admiralty records. An operations log from HMS Electra, a destroyer patrolling the Baltic in early 1945, contains a full page excised with the note, "Withheld for security reasons." Naval historians reviewing the case point to similar omissions in Admiralty files dealing with post-war seizures of German technology, such as advanced U-boat snorkel systems and jet engine prototypes. It is plausible that Sonnenrad, if real, fell into this same category. Classified not for irrelevance, but for its potential to alter Cold War communications warfare. Official British responses to inquiries in the 1950s labelled Convoy Eisbär irrelevant to war crimes. A curious dismissal for an event that claimed several ships and their crews. The American side reveals parallel shadows. US Navy archives contain references to Baltic Recovery Operations, Spring 1945, under the control of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The documents remain heavily redacted, but a surviving index card lists HF array components, classified disposition under captured materiel. No location or serial numbers are provided. This omission mirrors other cases where German technology was quietly folded into American military research, as with radar-guided bombs and infrared scopes. Whether the Sonnenrad array became part of US communications experiments at Fort Monmouth or White Sands remains speculative, yet circumstantial links suggest the knowledge did not vanish into the sea. For the families of the men who crewed Convoy Eisbär, the silence was absolute. Kriegsmarine records list them as missing, presumed lost at sea. No memorial plaques, no casualty counts, and no acknowledgement of the convoy's purpose were ever released. Survivors from East Prussia who watched the ships depart described them as merchant steamers under military escort, guarded by at least one U-boat. The presence of submarine protection implies cargo of extraordinary importance. Yet those U-boat logs never surfaced in Allied custody. Researchers attempting to trace them through German archives find only cross-references to files destroyed in late April 1945 by order of Dönitz himself. By the 1970s, Convoy Eisbär had become a subject of speculation among Baltic divers. Expeditions off Bornholm located wrecks consistent with German merchant vessels of the right period, but each appeared looted, machinery removed, and cargo holds empty. Radiation tests detected no anomalies, ruling out nuclear materials. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Without intact crates or surviving documents, the convoy remains a phantom, its story reconstructed only from fragments. Polish intelligence archives, opened after the Cold War, contain several references to Western agencies interfering with investigations of 1945 Baltic shipwrecks. This suggests the silence was actively enforced for decades. The real question is why. If Convoy Eisbär merely carried medicines and supplies, its loss would have been documented as a wartime tragedy. If it carried only conventional communications equipment, there would be no reason to erase it from history. The intensity of suppression indicates something far more valuable. A technology either successfully recovered and absorbed into Western research or lost forever beneath the Baltic. In either case, the truth remains buried under decades of classified seals and deliberate omissions. Today, Convoy Eisbär exists at the edge of history, a ghost fleet erased from both German surrender inventories and Allied seizure reports. Its name surfaces only in decrypted signals, whispered testimonies, and scattered notations in forgotten files. Whether the crates marked Sonnenrad ever reached a laboratory in Washington, London, or Moscow, or whether they rest in silt at the bottom of the Baltic, remains a mystery. But the silence that surrounds them is telling. In the war's final months, as Europe burned, something slipped into the sea and out of recorded history. Convoy Eisbär never reached Gdańsk, but its shadow stretches across the Cold War archives, a reminder that even in defeat, secrets traveled under armed guard, and some have never resurfaced. Chapter 3. Ghost Files of Operation Harborage. On April 21, 1945, as the Western Allies advanced deep into southern Germany, the United States Sixth Army received orders from Schaeff that were unlike any conventional military directive. The operation, codenamed Harborage, was to bypass populated towns, seize special scientific targets, and prevent their capture by French forces advancing from the south. These instructions came not from Eisenhower's headquarters, but from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, a joint Anglo-American body tasked with securing advanced German research before it could be destroyed or claimed by rival allies. While officially described as a mission to secure nuclear research facilities in Württemberg and Baden, fragments of declassified files suggest Harborage was more than a straightforward seizure. References to unregistered bunkers, sealed trunks flown directly to Washington, and materials labeled with ominous symbols point to an operation that remains largely obscured by classification. The primary targets of Operation Harborage were clustered around Hechingen, Haigerloch, and Horb, small towns nestled in the Swabian Alps, where the remnants of Germany's atomic program had relocated in late 1944. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, led nominally by Werner Heisenberg, had retreated from bombed-out Berlin and dispersed its laboratories into hidden caves and requisitioned factories. Harborage orders directed American forces to secure these facilities intact, seize all personnel, and confiscate equipment without delay. French forces, who were promised occupation rights in this sector, were explicitly excluded. General Devers of the US Sixth Army Group was instructed to ensure no foreign ally gained access before American intelligence had completed its work. The secrecy was total. Official reports from Harborage confirm the seizure of heavy water samples, uranium cubes, and experimental reactors. Yet within these same reports appear cryptic references to X-7 material and sealed consignments not for inter-allied disclosure. An after-action summary dated May 8, 1945, authored by Colonel John Lansdale Jr., head of Manhattan Project Security, lists 7 trunks of unclassified apparatus removed under guard. Witnesses later described these trunks as lead-lined and stamped with radiation warning symbols. Curiously, none of the trunks appear in Manhattan Project inventories released decades later. Where they were taken, and under whose authority remains unknown. Some researchers believe they contained uranium metal refined in France before the German retreat. Others suspect experimental isotope separation equipment. The absence of records leaves the question unanswered. French scientists who attempted to inspect the Hechingen sites days later were denied access by US military police. In frustration, General de Lattre de Tassigny lodged formal complaints to Schaeff about the unlawful seizure of French allocated territory. His protests were ignored. By the time French units reached Haigerloch in May, the reactor components had been removed, the laboratories stripped bare, and the German physicists already transported to American-controlled camps. French scientific intelligence reports describe empty rooms, broken crates, and the appearance of deliberate sanitization. The Americans left behind only fragments, just enough to show the French what they had missed. Buried in National Archives files is a tantalizing clue. A heavily redacted Harborage document dated May 1945 references recovered documentation coded Schwarze Sonne. The term appears nowhere else in Allied intelligence summaries of German nuclear research. The phrase translating to Black Sun has fueled decades of speculation. Some historians dismiss it as a mislabeling of esoteric SS symbols, while others argue it referred to a classified weapons project independent of Heisenberg's efforts. Testimonies from local residents, recorded by journalists in the 1950s, add further mystery. Several villagers claim that before the American arrival, trucks under SS Guard delivered unknown equipment into the Hechingen caves. Others recalled seeing men in protective suits wheeling lead containers into sealed chambers. None of these claims were investigated at the time. Whether true or a product of wartime fear, they align with the unexplained disappearance of trunks under Harborage control. The secrecy surrounding Operation Harborage did not end in 1945. German scientists seized during the raids were transferred not to Nuremberg for testimony, but to Fort Hunt in Virginia under Operation Alsos, a program designed to exploit Axis research. Their interrogations were conducted in strict isolation, with transcripts heavily censored before being shared with Allied partners. Surviving fragments suggest that several physicists spoke of alternative lines of inquiry pursued under SS sponsorship, unrelated to the official uranium reactor project. When pressed for details, the transcripts break off into redactions. These interviews remain classified under Department of Energy jurisdiction, suggesting sensitive nuclear relevance. One of the most persistent anomalies is the case of physicist Kurt Diebner, a rival to Heisenberg. Captured during Harborage, Diebner was reportedly transported to the United States under a false name and interrogated separately from the other German scientists. His post-war career is shadowy, with little documentation until his reappearance in Germany in the 1950s, where he quietly worked in civilian industries. What occurred in the years immediately following his capture is unknown. Some researchers suspect he may have cooperated with classified US nuclear programs before being repatriated under conditions of secrecy. The official narrative of Operation Harborage, presented in sanitized military histories, frames it as a successful preemptive seizure of German nuclear assets. Yet documents that have surfaced over decades tell a more troubling story. Entire consignments of material removed without acknowledgement, scientific data withheld even from Allied partners, and unexplained references to projects not otherwise documented in Nazi records. The silence is consistent, deliberate, and enduring. When the Manhattan Project declassified much of its wartime documentation in the 1970s, nothing was said of Schwarze Sonne or X-7 material. Requests filed under the Freedom of Information Act continue to return heavily redacted pages, with classification authority cited under national security exemptions. For the villagers of Hechingen and Haigerloch, the memory of those days lingers in more tangible ways. Some recall US soldiers working frantically to haul heavy equipment out of the caves, machinery that clanked and hissed as it was lifted onto trucks. Others recall the guarded airfields nearby, where C-47 transport planes departed under cover of night, carrying sealed crates to destinations unknown. Rumors of radiation sickness among local workers were quietly dismissed, though doctors in the region later reported unusual clusters of illness. These accounts, though anecdotal, fuel the suspicion that Harborage uncovered something more than experimental reactors. In the absence of clear records, Operation Harborage stands as one of the least understood yet most significant seizures of the war's end. Its official story, tightly controlled, tells of uranium cubes and scientific notebooks. Its unofficial story, pieced together from whispers, redactions, and fragments, speaks of trunks sealed against detection, coded references to projects erased from history, and a deliberate campaign to monopolize discoveries even at the expense of Allied trust. The ghost files of Harborage remain locked in archives, their contents withheld for reasons known only to those who wrote the orders. For historians, the unanswered questions persist. What was Schwarze Sonne? Why were consignments hidden from Allies? And what truths were removed from Hechingen before the French ever set foot in its caves? Chapter 4. Erased Atrocities of Unit Bergkristall. In the quiet Austrian town of St. Georgen, under Gusen, lies a scar in the earth, the Bergkristall tunnels. Officially, these subterranean complexes were constructed for Messerschmitt jet production, part of the Reich's desperate attempt to maintain air superiority in 1944. The factories were real. Tens of thousands of slave laborers from Mauthausen-Gusen toiled under unimaginable conditions to complete them. Yet declassified US Army intelligence files and suppressed survivor testimonies reveal that Bergkristall was more than an aircraft assembly line. It was a site of secret experimentation, guarded by SS engineers reporting directly to Heinrich Himmler, and its deepest chambers remain sealed to this day. The tunnels stretched for more than 75,000 square meters, carved into bedrock with forced labor at a cost of thousands of lives. Survivors testified that some galleries were off-limits even to workers, secured by electrified fencing and patrolled by black uniformed guards. In a post-war affidavit given to Austrian police in 1946, prisoner Anton K. described seeing machines larger than aircraft components, surrounded by cables emitting heat and sparks. He and his detail were quickly ordered away. Another survivor recalled the transport of massive lead-lined crates into a section marked Sonderbau, special construction. The crates were escorted by SS men with orders to shoot on sight anyone who approached. These sections do not appear in official Messerschmitt blueprints. When the US Army's 11th Armored Division liberated the area in May 1945, engineers documented the tunnel system with photographs and maps. Some of these images entered public record, showing jet fuselages and assembly lines, but others were immediately withdrawn and stamped sensitive. A declassified Office of Military Government report dated June 1945 lists Bergkristall as a priority intelligence target and notes the seizure of unidentified electrical equipment removed under armed guard. No descriptions or serial numbers accompany the entry. What became of the equipment is unclear. Austrian archives contain only fragments, often stamped NATO security interest, do not release. One of the most disturbing threads concerns radiation. In 1955, Austrian police investigated reports of unexplained illness among former tunnel workers who had survived the camps. Several displayed symptoms consistent with prolonged radiation exposure. Geiger counter surveys inside Bergkristall detected elevated readings in certain sealed galleries. But when local authorities attempted to pursue the matter, they were ordered to halt in the interest of Allied security. Officially, the radiation traces were attributed to natural mineral deposits, though independent geologists later disputed this explanation. The suspicion arose that experimental nuclear or radiological devices had been tested underground, far from prying eyes. Evidence supporting this claim emerges from captured SS correspondence. A letter from SS General Hans Kammler, architect of many underground facilities, references Bergkristall as the crown of the Special Weapons Program. Kammler's role in both V2 production and secret projects placed him at the nexus of advanced research and human exploitation. His disappearance in May 1945 remains one of the war's enduring mysteries. Some accounts place him in American custody. Others claim he took his own life. If he indeed oversaw Bergkristall's Sonderbau section, the knowledge he carried may have been absorbed into post-war US black projects. The complete absence of his testimony from Nuremberg trials is conspicuous. Local rumors persisted long after the war. Villagers spoke of nights when the sky above St. George glowed faintly, accompanied by muffled booms from deep underground. They whispered of burnt men carried out of the tunnels, prisoners who vanished into infirmaries and were never seen again. These accounts were dismissed as folklore until the 1990s, when Austrian researchers uncovered partial blueprints suggesting an additional 20,000 square meters of tunnel network unaccounted for in Allied surveys. These deeper chambers remain sealed by reinforced concrete, their entrances destroyed. Attempts to excavate have been blocked by legal disputes and military restrictions. Why the silence? In 1947, the US Counterintelligence Corps classified all reports on Bergkristall under Strategic Technology Acquisition. The files were removed from Austria and stored in Washington. When Austrian officials requested access in the 1960s, citing health concerns, they were denied on grounds of NATO secrecy. The implication is clear. Whatever was found inside Bergkristall was deemed of continuing military value long after the war. Whether experimental energy devices, radiological weapons, or advanced power systems, the artifacts of Sonderbau were not shared with the public or tribunals. Instead, they vanished into the machinery of Cold War secrecy. The human cost of Bergkristall was immense. More than 20,000 prisoners are believed to have died during its construction and operation. Survivors describe collapsing tunnels, starvation rations, and brutal SS punishments. Yet when testimonies surfaced describing unusual experiments, Allied prosecutors set them aside. The Nuremberg trials addressed slave labor and executions at Mauthausen, but made no mention of Sonderbau or possible weapons testing. The silence suggests deliberate omission, perhaps to shield intelligence gains. Justice for the victims of Bergkristall was sacrificed to geopolitics. In 2014, Austrian archaeologist Andreas Sulzer attempted to reopen investigations into Bergkristall's sealed sections. His excavation permits were abruptly revoked after local authorities cited national security concerns. The site was resealed and police patrols increased. Sulzer stated in interviews that he had found evidence of reinforced vaults and ventilation shafts inconsistent with aircraft assembly, more consistent with experimental laboratories. His work remains unfinished, blocked by layers of bureaucratic and international obstruction. Today, the tunnels of Bergkristall stand as a concrete enigma. The known sections testify to mass death and forced labor in service of jet production. The unknown sections whisper of darker projects, erased from records, suppressed by Allied intelligence, and buried under decades of secrecy. The testimonies of survivors, the traces of radiation, and the classified files all converge on a chilling possibility: that inside those sealed galleries, the Reich pursued weapons or technologies too dangerous to reveal, even in defeat. The atrocities of Bergkristall were not only human, but scientific, an exploitation erased from history, but not from the earth beneath St. Georgian. The silence surrounding it is its own indictment, a reminder that some truths were never meant to see daylight. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Prisoners of Fort Hunt. Hidden among the trees of Virginia's Potomac shoreline lies a park that once bore no public name. During the Second World War, Fort Hunt, known only as P.O. Box 1142, was one of the most secretive intelligence installations in the United States. Officially, it never held a single detainee. Unofficially, it was home to some of the Reich's most valuable captives, men whose crimes were buried beneath layers of redacted reports, and whose knowledge was deemed more important than their prosecution. What happened in those cell blocks and interrogation rooms remains one of the Cold War's most tightly held silences. Beginning in 1942, the US Army Intelligence Corps, working with the Office of Naval Intelligence, converted Fort Hunt into a top-secret interrogation center. Its existence was concealed even from Congress. German U-boat commanders captured in the Atlantic were brought there under cover of darkness, their arrival disguised through falsified POW transfers. Later, as Europe collapsed in 1945, scientists, engineers, and SS officers arrived, men who should have faced Nuremberg, but instead vanished into the corridors of P.O. Box 1142. The facility was designed not as a prison, but as an intelligence factory. No uniforms, no Red Cross access, no official registries. Prisoners were given numbers, not names, and their interrogations were recorded on reels that remain classified. The official cover story presented Fort Hunt as a recreation center for US soldiers. The reality was an interrogation program that bent the Geneva Convention beyond recognition. Declassified fragments show that U-boat captains provided early intelligence on the Enigma system, while scientists revealed radar countermeasures and jet propulsion details. But hidden among the released files are references to special detainees, Category X. These individuals never appear on prisoner lists and were not repatriated when the war ended. The records end with vague phrases, transferred to special custody, or further disposition classified. Their families in Germany searched for decades, filing inquiries with the International Red Cross, but the answers were always the same: no record found. One particularly troubling case concerns SS Sturmbannführer Otto Voss, a mid-level officer tied to Einsatzgruppe D massacres in Ukraine. Soviet prosecutors listed him for trial in absentia, yet he never appeared in any Allied doc. A mid-1946 US Army memorandum, discovered in the National Archives in 1998, notes that O. Voss remains of value for Eastern Front debriefs, held under restricted program at P.O. Box 1142. The memo is stamped "Do not release to War Crimes Commission." No subsequent trace of Voss exists in public record. Whether he died in custody, was resettled under a new identity, or absorbed into early CIA networks remains unknown. His victims were denied the chance to see justice done. Oral histories collected from American veterans in the 2000s shed additional light. Several interrogators recalled prisoners who were never logged, men who spoke of atrocities but were shielded because of the information they carried. One veteran described a special wing where SS officers were housed separately, guarded by military police instructed never to speak of them. Another recounted burning crates of documents in 1947 under orders, material he believed contained interrogation transcripts. These testimonies suggest that P.O. Box 1142 not only exploited enemy knowledge, but also actively erased evidence of war crimes in the process. Fort Hunt's secrecy was not an anomaly, but part of a broader pattern. Operation Paperclip brought dozens of German scientists to the United States, many of whom had been interrogated first at P.O. Box 1142. But unlike Paperclip, which eventually became public, the prisoner program remained hidden. When questioned by journalists in the 1970s, the Army flatly denied that Fort Hunt ever held detainees. Only in 2006, after pressure from historians, did the National Park Service acknowledge its true purpose. Yet even then, the narrative focused on U-boat captains and scientists, carefully omitting the unnamed SS officers and Category X detainees who never reappeared. The ethical cost of Fort Hunt is written not in open archives but in redactions and missing files. Each gap represents a life unaccounted for, a crime unprosecuted, a truth withheld. For American intelligence, the justification was simple. The Cold War demanded every advantage against the Soviet Union. Men with blood on their hands became assets, their atrocities washed away by usefulness. The moral compromise was buried beneath secrecy stamps. When veterans finally spoke decades later, they did so with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride at having served in a program that contributed to Allied victory. Unease at knowing justice had been sacrificed in silence. Today, the grounds of Fort Hunt are open to picnickers and joggers, with only a few plaques acknowledging its past. The cell blocks and interrogation rooms have long since been demolished. Yet beneath the surface lies a buried chapter of history. The forgotten prisoners who entered under cover of night and never emerged again into official record. Their voices exist only in fragments, on reels of tape that may still sit in classified vaults, labeled "not for release." For the families who searched, the silence is its own verdict. Fort Hunt remains a reminder that in the race for knowledge, democracies too can bury truths, leaving behind questions that echo long after the guns of war have fallen silent. And so the archives remain closed, the vault doors sealed behind walls of dust and redacted pages, leaving only the faint echo of what might have been uncovered. The silence itself is the final defense, the most powerful weapon, because silence cannot be cross-examined, cannot be condemned, cannot be undone. We are left staring into an abyss carved by omission, where shadows are thicker than memory and absence speaks louder than presence. Perhaps some truths were never meant to be spoken, only buried, guarded not by soldiers or steel, but by the collective decision to turn away. And in that silence, in that deliberate forgetting, lies the true cost of secrecy, the eternal uncertainty of whether what was hidden was too monstrous to reveal or too valuable to let slip into the light.